I'm Dr. Suraiya Shahin. Today I will teach you metaphysical poetry. Who are the poets who form metaphysical school and characteristics of metaphysical poetry? Then I will deal one by one all the metaphysical poets. All the students of English literature must know metaphysical poetry because this is assigned in their syllabus across our country. And also the students who are preparing for UGC NET JRF, they must know metaphysical poetry because they ask you questions sometimes. Who coined the term metaphysical poetry? Sometimes they ask you the characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Sometimes they give you the group of poets and you have to pick the one writer who belong to metaphysical poetry. Sometimes they ask you what's Dryden's views on metaphysical poetry, what Dr. Johnson said about metaphysical poetry. So you must know this topic, metaphysical poetry. Let me go ahead. The term metaphysical poetry was coined by Dr. Johnson in his book, Lives of English Poets. The term metaphysical poetry was coined by Dr. Johnson in his book, Lives of English Poets. Dr. Johnson further explained the term metaphysical poets and said, the metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. They neither copied nature nor life. Their thoughts are often new but seldom natural. They are not obvious, but neither are they just. And the reader, far from wondering that he missed them, wonders more frequently by what perverseness of industry they were ever found. Dr. Johnson used this term metaphysical poetry to describe a group of 17th century British poets, and the poets included in this group are John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Croshaw, Angie Marvel, Henry Vaughan, Thomas Traherne, John Cleveland, and Abraham Cowley. These are the poets who formed metaphysical school of poetry. You must know these poets. Now, who used the term metaphysical for the first time? Dr. Johnson used the term metaphysical borrowing from John Dryden's phrase. Who says about John Donne? He affects the metaphysics. And John Donne said it, Donne affects the metaphysics in his discourse concerning satire. Once in UGC NET examination, this question was also asked where John Dryden said Donne affects the metaphysics. So correct answer would be John Dryden said Donne affects the metaphysics in his discourse concerning satire. Remember, discourse concerning satire. Now I talk about characteristics of metaphysical poetry. The metaphysical poetry is deeply spiritual, religious, philosophical, and symbolic. Through the abrupt beginning of their poem, they startle the reader by their obscure and unpredictable imagery and concept. In their poetry, we find unique metaphors, far-fetched similes, and extravagant hyperboles. According to Walter Scott, they played with thoughts as the Elizabethans had played with words. Who played with thoughts? Walter Scott says it about metaphysical poets that they played with thoughts as the Elizabethans had played with words. The metaphysical poets carried the Elizabethan freedom of imagination and delight in verbal fancies to a point at which it became difficult for the average reader to grasp their meaning. Clear? So this is all about characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Now I deal one by one all the metaphysical poets. First is John Donne. John Donne is the first and leading poet of the metaphysical poetry. John Donne was the first poet to whom the epithet metaphysical was first applied by Dryden. John Donne wrote varieties of poems like elegies, satires, lyrics, religious and philosophical poems. We find in his poems metaphysical traits of religious, philosophical, which are marked with subtlety, odd imagery, conceits, and obscure allusions, which sometimes make the readers beyond the comprehension, beyond the understanding. We need a cultivated mind to understand the remarkable depth of meaning and insights. John Donne begins his poem abruptly as he starts his poem, The Sun Rising, by saying, "Busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us?" Here the poet John Donne calls the sun old, fool and busybody who doesn't know the rule of the universe. According to John Donne, when the two lovers are making love, the sun should not peep through the window and curtain and disturb them. So you need a cultivated mind to understand the poetry of metaphysical poets. Second is George Herbert. Herbert is called the saint of the metaphysical school. By profession, he was also a priest and he believed that a man should dedicate all his gifts to the service of God. Herbert's collection of lyrics called The Temple gives the true spirit of purest poetry. Apart from his perfect sincerity and devotion to God and religion, we also find in his poetry unique conceits, metaphors, and similes which appeal to the reader. Clear? Next is Richard Croshaw. Croshaw was influenced by Spanish mystic poets and he wrote much of his poetry after their fashion. We find the religious and sacred poetry of Croshaw, which has greater fire and passion. The Steps to Temple is a volume of poems which has religious traits. The poetry of Richard Croshaw is highly marked with symbols, imagery, and extravagances of metaphysical school. Next is Abraham Cowley. Abraham Cowley occupies a special place and that's why he is regarded as the chief representative poet of the metaphysical school of poetry. Cowley influenced a large number of poets, especially he influenced three metaphysical poets. And who are the three metaphysical poets whom Cowley influenced? Cowley influenced especially Croshaw, George Herbert, and Henry Vaughan. In the initial stage, Cowley started as a typical metaphysical poet with highly intricate conceits, imagery, and symbols. But later on, he discovered this extravagance and started writing in restrained and sober style. Clear? Next is Henry Vaughan. Henry Vaughan was greatly influenced by George Herbert. Even sometimes he indirectly copies the style of George Herbert. Since his piety is mystical and thoughts deeper, he is also called a mystic. His famous poem called "The World is Known for Its Wonderful Opening and Giving Philosophical Meaning," as he starts the poem and says, "I saw eternity the other night like a great ring of pure and endless light." Henry Vaughan is mostly known for his poems, his famous and successful poems. And his famous poem is "They Are All Gone Into a World of Light." Clear? Next is Andrew Marvell. What makes Andrew Marvell a unique poet among the metaphysical school is that he is the only Puritan among the metaphysical poets. He is recognized as a passionate lyrical poet of love and nature. Despite being a poet of metaphysical school, he doesn't share the quaintness and obscurity of his fellow poets. We find in his poetry the metaphysical traits of religious ardor and sense. Apart from it, he also writes love lyrics, as in his remarkable poem called "To His Coy Mistress." He celebrates love. The poem reflects the lover's deep sense of love for his beloved. The poem reflects that the lover courts his beloved and spends years praising every aspect of her beauty. Now next is Thomas Traherne. Thomas Traherne was the last of the metaphysical poets. He was a mystic poet. His sense of mysticism links him with the metaphysical school. His poetry remained lost for more than 200 years. His poetry remained lost for more than 200 years and then recovered and published in 1903. His poetry gives much beauty and eloquence and abundance of spiritual and philosophical insights. Okay, so these are the metaphysical poets. Okay, thanks for today.